The words that came out of Judge Agatha Roth's mouth that morning would haunt her for the rest of her life. "Oh, look what we have here. Another entitled little princess who thinks she can do whatever she wants in my city." Courtroom 3. B was packed. Every seat filled with defendants, lawyers, and curious observers who had no idea they were about to witness the downfall of one of the most corrupt judges in federal history. At the defendants' table stood a woman who looked wrong for this place. Dana Mitchell was clearly educated, clearly dignified, yet she stood there in handcuffs for allegedly trespassing in a public park. Judge Roth's eyes narrowed with the kind of hatred usually reserved for her worst enemies. "Miss Mitchell, or should I say Queen Mitchell, since you obviously think the rules don't apply to royalty like you." Roth grabbed the arrest report and read aloud, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "Subject was found sitting on a park bench after 9 p.m., appeared unusually calm when questioned, and, get this, actually quoted legal statutes to the arresting officer. How fascinating." Dana Mitchell said nothing, didn't flinch, didn't look away. She simply stood there with the kind of quiet confidence that seemed to make Judge Roth even angrier. "Bail is set at $50,000. Maybe that'll teach you some humility." The gasps from the gallery were audible. $50,000 for sitting on a park bench. But as Judge Roth smiled that cruel, satisfied smile, she had no idea that the woman standing before her had been planning this exact moment for 6 months. And the small device hidden beneath Dana's skin was recording every single word. The lock on Dana's handcuffs clicked twice, then silence. 4 hours earlier, in a nondescript office building across town, FBI Director Victoria Stone had reviewed the Operation Justice Shield files one final time. Her methodical preparation was legendary among federal agents. Every detail planned, every contingency covered, every piece of evidence authenticated before moving forward. The manila folder spread across her desk contained 6 months of painstaking investigation into what informants called the most profitable courthouse in the district. Photos of Judge Agatha Roth smiled from surveillance shots, arriving at charity galas in designer gowns, stepping out of luxury cars that cost more than most judges earned in 2 years. But it was the community impact reports that made Victoria's jaw clench. The Riverside District had become a war zone of systematic persecution. Families destroyed by fabricated charges. Young men disappeared into the prison system for crimes that wealthy defendants walked away from with warnings, all in service of Harrison Development's gentrification scheme. Victoria had built her career on one principle: the law applies to everyone, or it applies to no one. Today, she would test whether that principle still meant something. The transformation had taken 45 minutes in the FBI staging facility. Designer clothes replaced by thrift store finds, manicured nails chipped carefully, hair styled to look like she'd slept rough. The surgical implant behind her ear, no bigger than a grain of rice, would transmit every conversation directly to Agent Price's monitoring station. "You're insane, Director," Agent Price had said for the 20th time. "Going undercover as a vagrant defendant. What if they search you? What if Roth recognizes you from federal meetings?" Victoria had smiled the same quiet smile that Dana Mitchell would wear in court. "They won't recognize me because they don't see us. To them, we're all just problems to be solved." Meanwhile, across the city, Judge Agatha Roth was holding court like an empress holding audience with peasants. The morning docket moved with assembly line efficiency. Wealthy defendant, slap on the wrist, next case. Poor defendant, maximum sentence, next case. The pattern was so blatant it would have been comical if it weren't destroying lives. "Mr. Bradford," she sighed, looking down at a young man with a fraternity haircut and an expensive suit. "This is your second driving under the influence in 6 months. What do you have to say for yourself?" His lawyer, a slick man named Patterson, stood smoothly. "Your Honor, Chad is a good kid. He's applying for a mentorship program with the mayor's office. He simply made a poor judgment call." Roth's disapproval was theatrical rather than genuine. "Still, drunk driving is serious, Mr. Patterson," but there was no heat in it. "However, given the mayor's program, fine. $2,500 fine, 100 hours of community service, and a 90-day license suspension. Don't let me see you in here again, Mr. Bradford. You're better than this." The young man smirked as he walked away. In the gallery, an elderly black woman watched her grandson, arrested the same week for a broken taillight, get sentenced to 6 months. Same courthouse, same judge, different skin color. Bailiff Markson, a mountain of a man with dead eyes, called the next case with obvious relish. He lived for moments like these, when the powerful showed the powerless their place in the world. Officer Miller stood near the back, his police uniform crisp and his expression smug. He'd made 3 arrests in Riverside District this week alone, all minorities, all on questionable charges, all feeding into Judge Roth's machine. D.A. Coington watched from the prosecutor's table with the satisfaction of a man who'd found his calling. Justice was secondary to winning, and winning meant keeping Judge Roth happy. Her conviction rate made his office look good, and her endorsement would secure his political future. The system worked perfectly for them. Sarah Jenkins, the overworked public defender, shuffled papers with trembling hands. She'd watched this travesty for 3 years, losing case after case not to superior legal arguments but to predetermined outcomes. She'd filed complaints, written reports, begged supervisors to investigate. Nothing changed except the volume of her caseload. In the clerk's office, Rebecca Winters kept her head down and her mouth shut. She'd seen the financial records, the charity donations that appeared after favorable sentences, the vacation homes purchased on a judge's salary, the expensive gifts that materialized after cases were dismissed. She'd also seen what happened to court employees who asked too many questions, transfer to less desirable courthouses, poor performance reviews, sudden budget cuts that eliminated their positions. Judge Roth's reach extended far beyond her courtroom. But Rebecca had been documenting everything. Screenshots of scheduling anomalies, copies of unusual financial transactions, photos of evidence that mysteriously disappeared. She kept it all in a safety deposit box that Judge Roth didn't know existed. The gentrification machine was elegant in its simplicity. Harrison Development would identify a neighborhood ripe for luxury condos. Judge Roth would direct Officer Miller to increase patrols, finding reasons to arrest anyone who looked undesirable. Those arrests fed into her courtroom, where excessive sentences removed the problem residents. Clean neighborhood, rising property values, grateful developer donations. Everyone won except the families torn apart by the system. Trevor Harrison, the developer's entitled son, had learned this lesson early. When his DUI killed a cyclist last year, a quiet conversation between his father and Judge Roth transformed vehicular manslaughter into reckless driving. A $10,000 fine and his freedom. The victim's family got empty condolences and a system that valued their loved one's life at less than the cost of Harrison's monthly car payment. The ecosystem of corruption had taken years to perfect. Judge Roth provided the legal framework. D.A. Coington provided prosecutorial cover. Officer Miller provided the arrests. Bailiff Markson provided the muscle. Harrison Development provided the money. Patterson's law firm provided the legal laundering. And they would have continued indefinitely if Victoria Stone hadn't spent 6 months preparing to bring them all down. If you're already feeling that burning sense of injustice watching this corrupt judge target an innocent woman, then you understand exactly why this story matters. This isn't just entertainment. This is about real accountability in our justice system. Hit that like button if you believe no one should be above the law, and make sure to subscribe because we're just getting started with this incredible story of justice served. The courthouse steps buzzed with the usual morning activity. Lawyers clutching briefcases, defendants checking their phones nervously, family members offering last-minute encouragement. No one paid attention to the woman in thrift store clothes who walked past them with the fluid precision of someone accustomed to command. Dana Mitchell, as she would be known for the next few hours, had spent years studying body language, verbal patterns, and psychological manipulation. She knew exactly how to carry herself to project vulnerability while maintaining inner strength, how to speak quietly while commanding attention, how to appear defeated while planning victory. The arrest had been textbook. Officer Miller spotted her sitting on a bench in Riverside Park at 9:15 p.m., 15 minutes after the posted closing time. A perfect excuse for a quality-of-life arrest that would feed into the system. "Ma'am, park's closed," Miller had said, hand resting on his weapon despite facing a middle-aged woman reading a book. "I understand, officer. I was just finishing this chapter." Her voice was calm, educated, respectful. That should have been the end of it. A warning, maybe a citation. But Dana Mitchell wasn't the kind of defendant Officer Miller usually encountered in this neighborhood. She wasn't intimidated, wasn't apologetic, wasn't automatically submissive to his authority. "You need to move along now," he insisted, irritation creeping into his voice. "Of course. May I ask what specific statute covers park closure enforcement? I want to make sure I understand the law correctly." That question changed everything. In Miller's experience, people who quoted legal statutes were usually the kind of trouble that made paperwork complicated. Better to arrest her now and let the court sort it out. "Ma'am, you're being arrested for trespassing and failure to comply with lawful orders." The handcuffs had clicked with mechanical precision. The ride to county jail was silent except for Miller's radio chatter about another vagrant who thinks she's a lawyer. The booking process was deliberately humiliating. Strip search, delousing powder, fingerprints, mugshots. Through it all, Dana Mitchell maintained her composure. She answered questions politely, followed instructions without protest, showed no reaction to the casual insults and deliberate indignities. But behind her calm exterior, Victoria Stone was cataloging every constitutional violation, every procedural abuse, every moment of deliberate cruelty designed to break the spirit of defendants before they ever saw a courtroom. Speaking of protecting yourself in legal situations, today's sponsor is Legal Shield, the revolutionary app that gives you instant access to legal advice 24/7. Whether you're facing discrimination, police misconduct, or any legal challenge, Legal Shield connects you with experienced attorneys who can guide you through the process. For just dollars a month, you get unlimited consultations, document review, and legal representation when you need it most. Don't wait until you're facing a corrupt system alone. Download Legal Shield today and use code JUSTICE for your first month free. The holding cell smelled of industrial disinfectant and human despair. Victoria had been in worse conditions during her military service, but she'd never been surrounded by victims of the system she'd sworn to protect. The stories she heard that night would fuel her determination for years to come. "They got me for loitering," said a teenager whose crime was waiting for a bus. "Judge Roth gave me 60 days because I showed disrespect by asking for a court-appointed lawyer." "Broken taillight," said another. "Somehow became resisting arrest when I asked to see the damage. 6 months. Each story followed the same pattern. Minor infractions escalated to serious charges. Requests for basic rights treated as contempt of court. Excessive sentences designed to remove undesirable residents from gentrification targets. Victoria listened to every story, memorized every name, promised herself that each injustice would be answered when the time came. Dawn brought the familiar ritual of courthouse justice. Defendants were chained together and transported in buses that felt more like mobile prisons. The courthouse itself loomed like a temple to institutional power, marble columns and brass fixtures polished to intimidating perfection. But Victoria Stone had been in federal courthouses across the country. She knew the difference between buildings that served justice and buildings that served power. This courthouse served power. The arraignment calendar moved with ruthless efficiency. Judge Roth had perfected the art of assembly line justice, quick decisions based on predetermined criteria that had nothing to do with law and everything to do with demographics and bank accounts. "The People versus Trevor Harrison," Bailiff Markson announced with barely concealed satisfaction. The young man who entered looked like privilege personified. Designer suit, expensive haircut, the confident swagger of someone who'd never faced real consequences for anything. His father sat in the front row, a portly man whose wealth was evident in every thread of his custom clothing. "Mr. Harrison," Judge Roth's voice was warm, almost maternal. "This is a tragic situation for everyone involved." Patterson, the family's attorney, nodded solemnly. "Your Honor, my client is devastated by this accident, but the evidence shows the cyclist swerved unexpectedly into traffic. Mr. Harrison's blood alcohol was barely above the legal limit." The file told a different story. Victoria had read the real police reports. Trevor Harrison was traveling 45 miles per hour in a 25 zone. His blood alcohol was 0.114, well above the legal limit. He'd been texting while driving. The cyclist had been following all traffic laws, but those facts weren't mentioned in Judge Roth's courtroom. "Given the circumstances and Mr. Harrison's clean record, I'm reducing the charge to reckless driving. $5,000 fine and 100 hours of community service." The victim's family sat in stunned silence. A life lost to drunk driving became a parking ticket. Justice became a commodity that only the wealthy could afford. "Thank you, Your Honor," Patterson said smoothly. As the Harrisons left, the elder Harrison caught Judge Roth's eye and nodded once, a silent acknowledgement of services rendered. The temperature in the room shifted when they called Dana Mitchell's case. "The People versus Dana Mitchell," Markson announced, his voice carrying a different tone now, predatory anticipation. Victoria walked to the defendant's table with the measured pace of someone who'd appeared before countless tribunals. Sarah Jenkins, her court-appointed defender, looked up from her overflowing case files with the tired expression of someone fighting a losing battle. Judge Roth's demeanor transformed completely. Gone was the maternal warmth she'd shown Trevor Harrison. In its place was cold contempt that seemed to fill the courtroom like a toxic gas. "Miss Mitchell," Roth began, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd never been challenged. "Trespassing in a public park after hours, failure to comply with lawful orders, and," she paused for effect, "resisting arrest." The last charge was new. Victoria had been handcuffed without incident, but Officer Miller's report now claimed she'd tensed her arms and required additional force to secure compliance. Sarah Jenkins stood shakily. Your Honor, my client pleads not guilty to all charges. We request bail be set at own recognizance. She has no prior record and the charges are minor. Minor? Roth's laugh was sharp as broken glass. Miss Jenkins, your client was found trespassing in a park that's been the target of numerous drug deals and violent crimes. When approached by a police officer, she became argumentative and physically resistant. This is exactly the kind of behavior that's destroying our neighborhoods. Every word was a lie, but they were lies told with judicial authority in a system designed to believe judges over defendants. Furthermore, Roth continued, Miss Mitchell demonstrated a concerning familiarity with legal procedure during her arrest. In my experience, defendants who quote statutes to officers are usually repeat offenders who've learned to game the system. Victoria remained motionless, but behind her calm exterior she was documenting every constitutional violation. The Eighth Amendment's prohibition against excessive bail, the presumption of innocence, the right to be judged on evidence rather than speculation. Your Honor, Sarah Jenkins tried again, familiarity with the law isn't evidence of criminal behavior. Every citizen has the right to— Miss Jenkins, Roth's voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. Are you questioning my judicial discretion? The threat was clear. Challenge the court too aggressively and face sanctions that could destroy a legal career. Sarah had seen it happen to other public defenders who'd pushed too hard. No, Your Honor, but $50,000 for trespassing seems appropriate for someone who shows such blatant disrespect for law and order. Roth's gavel came down like a gunshot. Bail is set at $50,000. The defendant will remain in custody until trial or until she can post bond. The amount was staggering. Most defendants charged with violent felonies received lower bail, but Victoria Stone had expected exactly this outcome. The corruption ran so deep that even Judge Roth's prejudices followed predictable patterns. Your Honor, Dana Mitchell spoke for the first time, her voice calm and clear. May I ask on what specific grounds you're setting bail at this amount? The question hung in the air like a challenge. In most courtrooms, judges welcomed questions about their reasoning. It demonstrated that the system was transparent and accountable. But this wasn't most courtrooms. Judge Roth's face flushed crimson. Are you questioning my authority, Miss Mitchell? I'm asking about the legal basis for your decision, Your Honor. The Eighth Amendment requires that bail be reasonable in relation to the alleged offense. The gallery stirred. Defendants didn't usually cite constitutional amendments in arraignment court. They mumbled apologies and hoped for mercy. But Dana Mitchell quoted federal law like someone who'd spent years studying it. Bailiff Markson, Roth's voice carried pure venom now. Please inform the defendant that constitutional lectures are not welcome in my courtroom. Markson stepped forward, his massive frame designed to intimidate. But when his shadow fell across the defendant's table, Dana Mitchell didn't flinch. She looked up at him with the same calm attention she might give to a subordinate delivering a routine report. Miss Mitchell, Markson's voice was gravelly with implied threat. The judge doesn't appreciate being corrected by defendants. I appreciate the clarification, Victoria replied evenly. I'm simply trying to understand the legal framework governing these proceedings. The response was perfect, respectful enough to avoid contempt charges, but confident enough to suggest this wasn't her first experience with judicial procedure. Sarah Jenkins stared at her client with growing confusion. Most defendants facing $50,000 bail would be panicking. Dana Mitchell seemed almost prepared for this. Judge Roth's suspicion was evident. Miss Mitchell, what exactly is your profession? The question was designed as a trap. Admit to legal training and face accusations of practicing without a license. Claim ignorance and explain away the constitutional citations. Either way, provide ammunition for harsher treatment. I'm between projects at the moment, Your Honor. The answer was technically truthful. Operation Justice Shield was concluding, and Victoria hadn't yet decided on her next assignment. But it gave Judge Roth exactly the opening she wanted. So, you're unemployed, a vagrant, basically. Roth's smile was predatory. That explains the presumption of offering legal advice to sworn police officers. Your Honor, Sarah Jenkins interrupted desperately, my client's employment status isn't relevant to— It's extremely relevant, Miss Jenkins. Unemployed defendants are flight risks. They have no ties to the community, no stake in appearing for trial. $50,000 ensures Miss Mitchell will face the consequences of her actions. The logic was twisted but delivered with judicial authority. In Roth's courtroom, prejudice masqueraded as legal reasoning, and constitutional rights became privileges reserved for defendants who could afford them. Victoria Stone watched this perversion of justice with the clinical detachment of a surgeon examining a malignant tumor. Every word was being recorded. Every constitutional violation was being documented. Every moment of Judge Roth's systematic cruelty was building the case that would eventually destroy her. Furthermore, Roth continued, her confidence growing with each unchallenged abuse of power, "I'm adding a charge of contempt of court for Miss Mitchell's continued disrespect toward lawful authority." The contempt charge was pure retaliation, punishment for asking questions that made Judge Roth uncomfortable, but it carried serious consequences: additional jail time, higher bail, and a criminal record that would follow Victoria long after Operation Justice Shield concluded. "Your Honor," Sarah Jenkins was pleading now, "asking about legal procedures isn't contempt. Every defendant has the right to understand." "Every defendant has the right to remain silent," Roth snapped. Perhaps Miss Mitchell should exercise that right before she finds herself facing additional charges. The threat was clear: submit to judicial tyranny or face escalating punishment. It was the same choice offered to every minority defendant who passed through this courtroom: accept injustice quietly or suffer consequences that would destroy their lives. But Victoria Stone hadn't spent 6 months planning this operation to submit quietly to tyranny. "Your Honor, with respect, I believe my questions are within the rights guaranteed by the Sixth Amendment and relevant Supreme Court precedents, including Turner v. Rogers and United States v. Salerno." The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah Jenkins stared at her client in shock. Bailiff Markson's hand moved instinctively toward his weapon. Judge Roth's face went through several color changes before settling on a shade of purple that suggested either a stroke or an aneurysm. No defendant in Roth's courtroom had ever cited Supreme Court precedent. Most couldn't afford lawyers capable of such citations. Those who could afford good lawyers usually had their cases transferred to more favorable venues. But here was an unemployed vagrant quoting federal case law like a constitutional scholar. "Miss Mitchell," Roth's voice was barely controlled fury, "where exactly did you acquire this legal education?" "I read, Your Honor. The Constitution is a public document." Again, technically truthful. Victoria had indeed read the Constitution, along with thousands of legal opinions, federal statutes, and procedural manuals, but that reading had occurred during her law degree at Yale and her judicial clerkship before joining the FBI. Judge Roth sensed something dangerous happening but couldn't identify the threat. Defendants weren't supposed to be educated. They weren't supposed to understand their rights. They certainly weren't supposed to articulate constitutional principles with the precision of federal judges. "Reading doesn't make you a lawyer, Miss Mitchell, and it doesn't entitle you to lecture me about legal procedure in my own courtroom. I apologize if my questions seemed like lectures, Your Honor. I'm simply trying to understand the basis for decisions that will significantly impact my life and freedom." The apology was perfect, humble enough to seem respectful, but substantive enough to highlight the arbitrariness of Roth's rulings. Sarah Jenkins was beginning to realize that her client wasn't just unusually educated, she was strategically brilliant. Right now, you're probably feeling the same rage that every victim of this broken system felt, watching wealth and privilege walk free while regular people get crushed. If this hits close to home, if you've ever felt powerless against corruption, then share this video with someone who needs to see that change is possible. Your support helps us bring these crucial stories to light. The social dynamics outside Judge Roth's courtroom revealed the broader ecosystem supporting judicial corruption. Community leaders who should have been demanding accountability instead defended law and order in terms that barely concealed their racial bias. "We need judges who aren't afraid to clean up our neighborhoods," declared Councilman Richards, a Harrison Development ally whose campaign had been generously funded by construction interests. "Judge Roth understands that permissive attitudes toward minor crimes lead to major problems." The minor crimes he referenced were overwhelmingly committed by minorities. The major problems were gentrification obstacles that reduced property values in targeted development zones. Local media amplified this narrative with coverage that portrayed every arrest as evidence of criminal activity rather than potential prosecutorial abuse. Headlines screamed about vagrant arrests and trespassing crackdowns, without examining the constitutional issues or demographic patterns that made such arrests newsworthy. But alternative media was beginning to ask harder questions. Independent journalists noticed the statistical anomalies in Judge Roth's sentencing patterns. Civil rights bloggers documented the correlation between Harrison development projects and increased arrests in surrounding neighborhoods. Dana Mitchell's case became a focal point for these broader concerns when video of her arraignment appeared online. The footage showed a dignified woman facing systematic judicial bias with remarkable composure, quoting constitutional law while facing threats of additional prosecution. Social media exploded with commentary. Legal scholars analyzed her constitutional citations and pronounced them accurate. Civil rights advocates pointed to her case as evidence of systematic judicial abuse. Conservative voices defended Judge Roth's authority while avoiding discussion of the constitutional issues. The pressure was building, but Judge Roth had weathered such storms before. Her political connections ran deep. Her conviction rates impressed prosecutors. Her fundraising ability attracted campaign donations from grateful developers and attorneys. She responded to criticism with the righteous indignation of someone who'd never faced meaningful accountability. Armchair lawyers and social media activists don't understand the realities of maintaining order in our courtrooms, she told a friendly reporter. Every defendant thinks they're a constitutional scholar. That's why we have trained legal professionals to make these decisions. The irony was staggering. Judge Roth dismissed actual constitutional scholarship as amateur opinion while making legal rulings based on personal prejudice and financial incentives. Meanwhile, the professional legal community was beginning to take notice. The local bar association received formal complaints about constitutional violations in Roth's courtroom. Federal court clerks quietly discussed filing judicial misconduct reports. Law professors used her cases as examples of what not to do in constitutional law classes. But institutional change moved slowly, and Judge Roth had learned to navigate bureaucratic resistance with the skill of a career politician. Complaints disappeared into administrative procedures. Misconduct reports were buried in committee reviews. Academic criticism was dismissed as theoretical nitpicking by scholars who'd never faced the practical challenges of criminal justice. The system protected its own, even when its own represented everything the system was supposed to prevent. Dana Mitchell's case was scheduled for trial in 6 weeks, an unusually fast timeline that suggested Judge Roth wanted to resolve this problem before media attention grew more intense. The quick scheduling also limited preparation time for the defense, a tactical advantage that prosecutors regularly exploited. Sarah Jenkins was struggling with a caseload that made adequate representation nearly impossible. 37 active cases, each requiring research, investigation, witness interviews, and trial preparation. The public defender's office was systematically underfunded to ensure that poor defendants received inferior representation. But Dana Mitchell was different from Sarah's other clients. She didn't need explanations of basic legal concepts. She understood procedural timelines and evidentiary standards. She asked questions that revealed sophisticated understanding of constitutional protections. "Have you practiced law before?" Sarah asked during their first real conference. "No, but I've always been interested in justice," Victoria replied, maintaining her cover while providing technical assistance that improved the quality of her own defense. The professional escalation began when DA Coington decided that Dana Mitchell's case required special attention. A defendant who cited Supreme Court precedent represented a potential embarrassment if she managed to articulate constitutional violations convincingly during trial testimony. "We need to make this case go away quickly," Coington told his senior prosecutors. "Judge Roth wants a clean conviction that demonstrates the consequences of disrespecting judicial authority." The solution was prosecutorial overkill. Minor charges were enhanced with aggravating factors. Character evidence was prepared to portray Dana Mitchell as a repeat offender despite her clean record. Witness testimony was coached to emphasize her aggressive and uncooperative behavior. Coington also arranged for expert testimony from Dr. Patricia Hayes, a psychologist who specialized in oppositional personality disorders, and regularly testified that defendants who asserted their rights were mentally unstable. "Miss Mitchell's behavior follows a classic pattern," Dr. Hayes would testify. "Grandiose self-perception, resistance to authority, and inappropriate legal terminology usage all suggest underlying antisocial tendencies." The psychological evaluation was character assassination disguised as scientific analysis. But it would sound impressive to jurors who weren't familiar with the difference between legitimate expertise and prosecutorial theater. Victoria Stone reviewed these preparations through intelligence reports from Agent Price, who had infiltrated the prosecutor's office as a paralegal. The corruption was even more systematic than her initial investigation had suggested. Dr. Hayes had testified in 47 cases over 3 years. 46 defendants were minorities. All received diagnoses that supported prosecution arguments for enhanced sentencing. The statistical pattern was so clear that any honest review would have exposed the fraud immediately. But honest reviews weren't conducted in DA Coington's office. His prosecutors were rewarded for conviction rates, not constitutional compliance. They learned to view defense attorneys as obstacles to justice rather than essential components of legal procedure. The technical challenge came when Patterson's law firm filed a motion to represent Dana Mitchell pro bono, a generous offer that concealed ulterior motives. Patterson had built his practice on Judge Roth's favorable rulings for wealthy clients. A high-profile defense of a minority defendant would provide cover for his more questionable activities. "Miss Mitchell," Patterson explained during their meeting, "my firm specializes in constitutional law. We can provide resources that the public defender's office simply doesn't have." It was a tempting offer. Patterson's resources included private investigators, expert witnesses, and appellate specialists. His reputation could legitimize constitutional challenges that might be dismissed if raised by overworked public defenders. But Victoria Stone knew Patterson's true role in the corruption network. His constitutional expertise was carefully limited to cases that wouldn't threaten Judge Roth's authority. His resources came with strings that would compromise any effective defense. "I appreciate the offer," Victoria replied, "but I'm confident in Ms. Jenkins' representation." Patterson's surprise was evident. Defendants facing serious charges didn't usually refuse prominent legal representation, but Dana Mitchell seemed immune to the intimidation tactics that usually made such offers irresistible. The skill demonstration came during a preliminary hearing where prosecution witnesses testified about Dana's arrest. Officer Miller's testimony was clearly rehearsed, painting a picture of aggressive resistance that bore no resemblance to the actual encounter. The defendant became agitated when asked to leave the park, Miller testified. "She began quoting legal statutes in a manner that seemed designed to interfere with my duties." Under cross-examination by Sarah Jenkins, Miller's story began to unravel. His report mentioned constitutional citations, but couldn't specify which amendments were referenced. His description of physical resistance conflicted with his own notes about cooperative behavior during handcuffing. But the real surprise came when Dana Mitchell was allowed to question the witness directly, a rarely used procedural right that most defendants didn't know existed. "Officer Miller, in your report you state that I quoted legal statutes. Can you identify which statutes?" Miller shifted uncomfortably. "I don't remember the specific citations. Your report mentions constitutional amendments. Which amendments did I reference? I can't recall exactly. Did my citation of legal principles interfere with your official duties in any specific way?" The question was precisely crafted. If Miller said yes, he'd have to explain how knowledge of the law constituted interference with police work. If he said no, he'd undermine the prosecution's case about obstruction. Well, it showed a confrontational attitude. "Officer Miller, is citizens' knowledge of their constitutional rights inherently confrontational?" The question hung in the air like an indictment of the entire system. Judge Roth intervened before Miller could answer, but the damage was done. Dana Mitchell had just demonstrated that she understood legal procedure better than the arresting officer. Whispers filled the gallery. Even Judge Roth's supporters seemed uncomfortable with the implications. If knowing the Constitution was evidence of criminality, then civic education became a threat to law enforcement. After the hearing, legal observers buzzed with speculation about Dana Mitchell's background. Her questioning technique was sophisticated enough to suggest formal legal training. Her knowledge of procedural rights exceeded that of many attorneys. But employment records showed no legal education. Background checks revealed no law enforcement or judicial experience. She remained an enigma, a vagrant who argued like a federal judge. Financial emergencies can make anyone vulnerable to predatory systems, which is why today's sponsor, Emergency Fund Pro, is so crucial. This innovative savings app automatically sets aside small amounts from your daily purchases, building an emergency fund that can cover legal fees, bail money, or any unexpected crisis. With features like automatic roundups and high-yield savings, Emergency Fund Pro has helped over 2 million Americans build financial security. Download Emergency Fund Pro today and use code PREPARED for a $50 bonus when you save your first $100. The legal escalation began when federal authorities took notice of Dana Mitchell's case. Her constitutional challenges had been filed with precision that suggested familiarity with federal procedures. Her arguments referenced obscure precedents that most attorneys would need to research extensively. FBI Civil Rights Division attorneys began reviewing Judge Roth's sentencing patterns as part of a broader investigation into systematic constitutional violations. Dana Mitchell's case provided a perfect illustration of the problems they were documenting. Agent Caroline Blake, a federal prosecutor specializing in judicial corruption, recognized the strategic value of a case where constitutional violations were so clear and well documented. "This isn't just about one defendant," she told her supervisor. "Judge Roth's behavior in this case demonstrates systematic disregard for constitutional protections. If we can prove pattern and practice, we can seek federal intervention." The federal attention terrified Judge Roth's network. Corruption that was invisible to local oversight became obvious under federal scrutiny. Financial patterns that seemed normal in isolation revealed systematic abuse when analyzed comprehensively. D.A. Coington began distancing himself from Judge Roth's more extreme rulings. Officer Miller requested transfer to a different district. Patterson's law firm quietly stopped accepting new cases that might require Judge Roth's cooperation. But Judge Roth herself doubled down on her authority. Federal oversight was exactly the kind of outside interference that threatened judicial independence. She would not be intimidated by bureaucrats who didn't understand the practical challenges of maintaining order. "This courthouse operates according to established legal principles," she told reporters. "We will not be deterred by political pressure from federal activists who want to micromanage local justice." The characterization was typical of her approach, portraying constitutional compliance as political activism and federal oversight as bureaucratic interference. But it revealed her fundamental misunderstanding of the legal system she claimed to represent. Federal judges weren't political activists. They were constitutional guardians, whose authority superseded local judicial opinions when civil rights were at stake. Judge Roth's defiance wasn't judicial independence. It was institutional rebellion against the rule of law. The physical escalation began when Bailiff Markson decided that Dana Mitchell needed a more personal lesson in respecting authority. The holding cells provided opportunities for educational conversations that wouldn't be recorded or witnessed by defense attorneys. "You think you're smart, don't you?" Markson cornered Victoria in the cell during a lunch break, throwing around big words like you're some kind of lawyer. His massive frame blocked the cell door, creating an atmosphere of implied threat without technically committing assault. It was a technique he'd perfected over years of intimidating defendants who couldn't afford effective representation. "I'm just trying to understand my legal situation," Victoria replied calmly. "Your legal situation is that you disrespected Judge Roth in her own courtroom. That kind of disrespect has consequences." The threat was clear without being specific enough to constitute criminal behavior. Markson had learned to operate in legal gray areas where intimidation was plausible deniability rather than actionable misconduct. But Victoria Stone had faced actual threats from actual criminals during 20 years of federal law enforcement. Bailiff Markson was a courthouse bully whose power depended entirely on his victim's fear and isolation. "I understand your concern," she replied with the same calm professionalism she'd used to de-escalate hostage situations. "I'll certainly be more careful about how I phrase my questions." Markson was expecting fear, anger, or submission. Instead, he got professional courtesy that made his intimidation tactics seem petty and unprofessional. The response left him confused and frustrated, emotions that made him more dangerous. "Just remember that accidents can happen to defendants who don't know their place," he muttered before leaving. The threat was recorded by Victoria's hidden audio device and transmitted to Agent Price's monitoring station. But more importantly, it revealed Markson's willingness to use violence against defendants who challenged the system. That evening, Agent Price reviewed the day's recordings with growing concern. The corruption was more systematic and more violent than their initial intelligence had suggested. Judge Roth wasn't just biased. She was operating a criminal enterprise that used the justice system to enrich herself and her co-conspirators. "Director, this is getting dangerous," Price warned during their secure communication. "Markson is talking about physical violence. Maybe we should extract you now and proceed with arrests based on what we've already recorded." Victoria considered the suggestion. They had enough evidence to seek federal indictments against Judge Roth, Markson, Miller, and probably Coington. The recordings documented systematic constitutional violations and clear evidence of corruption. But extracting now would leave hundreds of victims without justice and allow higher-level corruption to continue. The Harrison Development Connection suggested that Judge Roth's network was part of a larger pattern of institutional abuse. Not yet, Victoria decided. We need to see how deep this goes. And these victims deserve to see their oppressors face full accountability, not just plea bargains that let them retire quietly. The decision was strategic rather than personal. Victoria Stone had spent her career building cases that achieved maximum justice rather than quick headlines. Operation Justice Shield would succeed only if it dismantled the entire corruption network rather than just removing its most visible participants. The community pressure was building as social media coverage expanded national attention on Dana Mitchell's case. Civil rights organizations began filing amicus briefs supporting her constitutional challenges. Legal scholars published analyses of Judge Roth's sentencing patterns that revealed systematic bias. But the most powerful pressure came from other victims of the system. Families who had lost loved ones to excessive sentences began speaking publicly about their experiences. Former defendants shared stories of constitutional violations and prosecutorial abuse. Leon Thomas, the young man whose marijuana possession had earned a 3-year sentence, became a powerful spokesperson for reform. His articulate testimony about systematic targeting of minority defendants resonated with national audiences who were shocked by the extremity of Judge Roth's sentences. "They don't see us as human beings," Leon testified before a congressional subcommittee investigating judicial misconduct. "We're just problems to be solved, numbers to make their statistics look good." The congressional testimony was devastating for Judge Roth's reputation. Leon's case exemplified everything wrong with her approach to justice. A young man's life destroyed by judicial prejudice and prosecutorial ambition. Judge Roth responded with characteristic arrogance, dismissing congressional oversight as political theater by lawmakers who've never handled a criminal docket. But federal oversight was exactly what the Constitution required when local authorities systematically violated civil rights. Judge Roth's defiance wasn't judicial independence, it was institutional contempt for constitutional governance. In the clerk's office, Rebecca Winters watched the mounting pressure with growing hope. She'd spent 3 years documenting Judge Roth's corruption, waiting for someone with the power to act on the evidence she'd collected. The financial records she'd preserved showed a clear pattern of bribes disguised as charitable donations. The scheduling anomalies revealed how certain attorneys received favorable treatment. The evidence tampering incidents demonstrated systematic obstruction of justice. But most importantly, Rebecca had been recording conversations. Her position as head clerk gave her access to Judge Roth's chambers where the most damaging discussions occurred. She'd heard the explicit coordination with D.A. Coington. She'd witnessed the direct communication with Harrison Development. She'd documented the threats against other court employees who'd attempted to report misconduct. Rebecca knew that coming forward would end her career and possibly endanger her safety. But watching Dana Mitchell's courageous stand against the system had inspired her to finally act. She reached out to Agent Caroline Blake through an encrypted communication system, offering to provide federal authorities with everything she'd collected over 3 years of systematic documentation. "I can give you bank records, audio recordings, email communications, and witness testimony," Rebecca told the federal prosecutor. Judge Roth isn't just corrupt. She's running a criminal enterprise that's destroyed hundreds of lives. The evidence Rebecca provided transformed the federal investigation from a civil rights inquiry into a racketeering case. The financial records alone revealed millions of dollars in illegal transactions. The audio recordings captured explicit criminal conspiracies. The documentary evidence proved systematic obstruction of justice. But the most damaging evidence was yet to come. Dana Mitchell's case was building toward a climax that would expose the full scope of the corruption and reveal her true identity to a world that was about to learn what happened when the FBI decided to investigate its own justice system. Understanding your rights is your best protection against judicial abuse, which is why I'm excited to partner with Themis Legal Academy. Their online courses teach you constitutional law, criminal procedure, and civil rights in easy-to-understand modules created by practicing attorneys. Whether you want to better protect yourself and your family, or you're considering a career in law, Themis gives you the knowledge that corrupt officials hope you never have. Visit themisacademy.com and use code RIGHTS for 40% off any course. The stakes were rising as media attention attracted federal resources to what had seemed like a local problem. Operation Justice Shield was approaching its climactic phase, and Victoria Stone was about to reveal the true scope of the corruption she'd been investigating. The preliminary hearings had established the constitutional violations. The financial investigation had documented the systematic corruption. The witness testimony had revealed the human cost of judicial abuse. But the most dramatic confrontation was yet to come. Judge Roth was about to face the full power of federal law enforcement, and Dana Mitchell was about to reveal her true identity to a courtroom that had no idea they'd been testing themselves against the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The revolution was about to begin, and it would reshape American understanding of how far corruption could penetrate the institutions designed to protect constitutional rights. Tomorrow, in the same courtroom where she'd been systematically abused and constitutionally violated, Victoria Stone would reveal the hidden device that had recorded every word, document the evidence that would destroy the corruption network, and demonstrate that in America, no one, not even a federal judge, was above the law. The recording device beneath her skin had captured hundreds of hours of evidence that would send Judge Roth and her co-conspirators to federal prison for the rest of their lives. But the most dramatic recordings were yet to come. The next phase would test whether America's legal system could still hold its most powerful officials accountable when they betrayed their oaths and violated their citizens' most fundamental rights. Judge Roth believed she was untouchable. Tomorrow she would learn that she was wrong. The federal investigation into Judge Agatha Roth's courtroom had reached a critical threshold. What began as routine civil rights monitoring had evolved into the largest judicial corruption case in the district's history. Agent Caroline Blake coordinated a team of 12 federal prosecutors, 6 FBI financial crimes specialists, and 4 civil rights attorneys who were building an airtight case against the entire network. But they still needed the smoking gun that would make prosecution inevitable. Rebecca Winters provided that smoking gun in the form of 3 years' worth of meticulously documented evidence. Her safety deposit box contained more than just financial records and scheduling anomalies. It held audio recordings that would destroy Judge Roth's career and send her to federal prison. I started recording conversations after Judge Roth threatened to fire me for asking about a missing evidence file, Rebecca explained to Agent Blake during their first meeting. She said I was asking too many questions for a clerk, and that smart employees know when to be blind and deaf. The recordings were devastating. Judge Roth's voice discussing cleaning up neighborhoods for Harrison Development. D.A. Coington coordinating charges to maximize sentences for minority defendants. Bailiff Markson planning intimidation tactics against witnesses who might testify about courthouse violence. But the most damaging recording captured a conversation between Judge Roth and Harrison Development's chief financial officer about the administrative fees required for favorable rulings. Your Honor, Mr. Harrison wanted me to confirm the arrangements for the Riverside project. The CFO's voice was clear on the recording. The usual donation to your charity, plus the consultant fee for your husband's firm. The Community Improvement Fund requires $50,000 for each favorable ruling. Judge Roth responded matter-of-factly. Marcus's consulting work is separate, another $25,000, and I'll need advance payment for the Mitchell case. She's become a problem that needs to disappear quickly. The recording was made just 2 days before Dana Mitchell's arraignment. It proved that Judge Roth had decided to give her maximum sentences before ever hearing the evidence. It demonstrated that constitutional rights were being sold to the highest bidder. Agent Blake immediately secured federal warrants for financial records, email communications, and phone recordings. The evidence trail led from Judge Roth's courthouse to offshore bank accounts in the Cayman Islands, shell corporations in Delaware, and luxury purchases that no judge could afford on their official salary. The financial investigation revealed a sophisticated money laundering operation. Harrison Development's payments went to a charity called Community Justice Initiative, which existed only on paper. The charity's funds were then transferred to consulting contracts for Judge Roth's husband, who provided no actual services. From there, the money moved through multiple accounts before ending up in Judge Roth's personal finances. But the corruption went deeper than simple bribery. Judge Roth was coordinating with at least 3 other judges in neighboring districts, creating a regional network of judicial corruption that affected thousands of defendants. Agent Price continued monitoring Operation Justice Shield from his mobile command center, watching Victoria Stone endure systematic abuse while building the case that would eventually free hundreds of wrongfully convicted defendants. Director, we've got enough evidence to arrest the entire network right now, Price reported during their evening communication. Bank records, audio recordings, witness testimony, financial documents. We could have warrants executed tomorrow. Victoria's response was measured but firm. What's the status on the other districts Blake mentioned? 3 additional judges showing similar patterns. Judge Franklin in the Northern District, Judge Morrison in the Eastern District, and Judge Walsh in the Southern District, all showing the same statistical anomalies. Disproportionate sentencing for minorities, unusual leniency for wealthy defendants, and financial patterns that suggest coordinated corruption. Victoria processed this information with the strategic thinking that had made her one of the FBI's most successful directors. Taking down Judge Roth's network would be satisfying, but allowing the broader corruption to continue would betray every victim of the system. We wait, she decided. Blake needs time to build cases against all 4 districts simultaneously. If we move too early, the others will destroy evidence and disappear. Justice delayed for a few more weeks means justice delivered for thousands more victims. The decision required Victoria to endure continued abuse and constitutional violations while the investigation expanded. But she'd spent 20 years in federal law enforcement making difficult choices that served the greater good rather than immediate satisfaction. Meanwhile, Dana Mitchell's case was generating national attention that complicated Judge Roth's usual tactics. Media coverage had attracted civil rights organizations, legal scholars, and congressional oversight committees. The courthouse was crawling with reporters, federal observers, and activists who were documenting every proceeding. Judge Roth responded to the attention with characteristic arrogance. doubling down on her authority rather than moderating her behavior. She seemed to believe that federal oversight would eventually lose interest and move on to other cases. "The Constitution doesn't guarantee that defendants will like their judges," she told a friendly reporter. "My job is to apply the law fairly and consistently. If that makes some people uncomfortable, so be it." The statement revealed her complete misunderstanding of the constitutional violations she was committing. Federal oversight wasn't about judicial popularity. It was about systematic denial of constitutional rights. Judge Roth's defiance only provided more evidence for federal prosecutors. The pressure was building from multiple directions. Congressional subcommittees were demanding answers about judicial misconduct. Civil rights organizations were filing federal lawsuits challenging the constitutionality of excessive bail and systematic sentencing disparities. Legal scholars were publishing analyses of Judge Roth's rulings that demonstrated clear patterns of bias. But Judge Roth had weathered such storms before. Her political connections included influential senators, powerful lobbyists, and wealthy donors who benefited from her approach to justice. She believed her network of protection would outlast federal attention. She was wrong. Agent Blake's investigation had uncovered evidence that some of Judge Roth's political protectors were themselves benefiting from the corruption network. Campaign donations from Harrison Development and other construction companies had influenced legislation, zoning decisions, and judicial appointments. The corruption reached into state government, federal agencies, and even congressional offices. "This isn't just about one corrupt judge," Blake reported to FBI Director Victoria Stone through official channels, unaware that she was communicating with the undercover defendant whose case had triggered the investigation. "We're looking at systematic corruption that affects multiple levels of government." The Financial Crimes Division traced money flows that connected Judge Roth's network to construction projects worth hundreds of millions of dollars. The gentrification scheme had displaced thousands of minority families, generated enormous profits for connected developers, and corrupted multiple government institutions. But the human cost was even more staggering. Rebecca Winter's records documented over 2,000 cases where minority defendants received excessive sentences for minor offenses. The systematic targeting had destroyed communities, separated families, and created a pipeline that fed minority citizens into for-profit prisons owned by Harrison Development's subsidiary companies. The corruption was elegant and comprehensive. Harrison Development identified neighborhoods for gentrification. Judge Roth directed increased police patrols that targeted minority residents. Officer Miller and others provided arrests on questionable charges. DA Coington ensured prosecutions with enhanced penalties. Judge Roth imposed excessive sentences that removed undesirable residents. Harrison Development purchased the newly clean property at reduced prices and built luxury condos. Everyone profited except the families whose lives were destroyed by the system. You just witnessed one of the most satisfying reveals in courtroom history. But this story is far from over. The federal investigation is about to expose corruption that goes deeper than anyone imagined. Make sure you're subscribed with notifications on because the next phase of this takedown is about to blow your mind. Leon Thomas had become the public face of Judge Roth's victims, testifying before congressional committees and speaking at civil rights rallies. His articulate descriptions of systematic persecution resonated with audiences who were shocked by the extremity of judicial abuse. "They arrested me for having one marijuana cigarette," Leon told a packed auditorium at Howard University. "Judge Roth gave me 3 years in prison. The same week, a white college student was arrested with 2 pounds of cocaine. Judge Roth gave him probation and community service." The statistical disparities in Judge Roth's sentencing patterns were so extreme that they constituted mathematical proof of systematic bias. Minority defendants received sentences that were, on average, 400% longer than white defendants charged with identical crimes. The pattern held across every category of offense and every demographic variable. But Judge Roth's supporters dismissed these statistics as misleading and taken out of context. They argued that minority defendants had more prior offenses, showed less respect in court, and came from communities with higher crime rates. The arguments were racist nonsense designed to justify systematic constitutional violations. But they revealed how deeply the corruption had penetrated public discourse about justice and equality. Dr. Patricia Hayes, the psychologist who specialized in diagnosing minority defendants with personality disorders, had become a key prosecution witness in dozens of cases. Her testimony provided scientific-sounding justification for enhanced sentences based on antisocial tendencies and oppositional behavior. But Agent Blake's investigation revealed that Dr. Hayes had no legitimate credentials in forensic psychology. Her doctoral degree was from an unaccredited online university. Her research on personality disorders was plagiarized from outdated textbooks. Her diagnoses were based on brief interviews designed to reach predetermined conclusions. Dr. Hayes is a fraud, Agent Blake reported to the Department of Justice. She's provided false testimony in over 40 cases, resulting in wrongful convictions and excessive sentences. Every case she touched needs to be reviewed for prosecutorial misconduct. The revelation that prosecution expert witnesses were committing perjury added federal fraud charges to the growing list of crimes being investigated. It also meant that hundreds of additional defendants might have grounds for appeals based on false testimony. The investigation was expanding exponentially as each piece of evidence revealed new layers of corruption. What had begun as civil rights violations now included racketeering, money laundering, mail fraud, wire fraud, conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and violation of federal civil rights statutes. Judge Roth's network wasn't just corrupt. It was a criminal enterprise that had operated under the protection of judicial immunity for over a decade. Victoria Stone endured another week of constitutional violations while Agent Blake built the comprehensive case that would ensure maximum sentences for everyone involved. The hidden recording device captured Judge Roth's increasingly desperate attempts to resolve the Dana Mitchell problem before federal attention grew more intense. "We need to end this quickly," Judge Roth told DA Coington during a recorded phone conversation. "Federal prosecutors are asking questions about sentencing patterns. The Mitchell case is attracting too much attention." "What do you want me to do?" Coington responded. "She's not intimidated by normal pressure. Her lawyer is starting to file constitutional challenges that could expose our entire operation. Then find charges that can't be challenged. Plant evidence if you have to. Get her a conviction that's too serious for media sympathy." The conversation was recorded on federal surveillance equipment and transmitted directly to Agent Blake's team. Judge Roth had just confessed to conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and solicitation of evidence tampering. The recording alone was sufficient grounds for immediate arrest. But Victoria Stone's strategy required waiting for the broader network to expose itself completely. Judge Roth's desperation would force mistakes that revealed the full scope of the corruption. Bailiff Markson's intimidation tactics escalated as Judge Roth pressured him to resolve the Dana Mitchell situation. His threats became more explicit, his physical presence more menacing, his suggestions of accidents more frequent. "Judge Roth is asking a lot of questions about your safety in custody," Markson told Victoria during another holding cell confrontation. "She's worried that someone might get hurt if this case goes to trial." The threat was clear: plead guilty or face violence. It was the same choice offered to countless defendants who had passed through Judge Roth's system: submit to injustice or suffer consequences that could destroy their lives. But Victoria Stone wasn't intimidated by courthouse bullies. She'd faced actual terrorists, organized crime leaders, and international war criminals. Bailiff Markson was a small-time criminal whose power depended entirely on institutional protection. "I appreciate Judge Roth's concern for my safety," Victoria replied calmly. "I'm sure the federal authorities monitoring this facility share her commitment to protecting defendants from violence." Markson's confusion was evident. How did an unemployed vagrant know about federal monitoring? Why wasn't she terrified of his threats? Who was this woman who seemed immune to the intimidation tactics that had worked on thousands of other defendants? The questions troubled Markson enough that he reported his concerns to Judge Roth, who was beginning to suspect that Dana Mitchell wasn't what she appeared to be. The trial preparation phase revealed the full extent of prosecutorial misconduct in Dana Mitchell's case. DA Coington had assembled what he called his conviction insurance package: fabricated evidence, false witness testimony, and expert opinions designed to guarantee a guilty verdict regardless of the actual facts. Officer Miller's revised police report bore little resemblance to the original incident. Dana Mitchell's aggressive resistance now included attempting to assault an officer and threatening to file false police reports. The charges had escalated from simple trespassing to felony assault on a police officer. The fabricated evidence included photographs that supposedly showed damage to Officer Miller's uniform from Dana's attack. The photos were clearly staged: tears in fabric that could have been made with scissors, scuff marks that appeared fresh rather than consistent with the alleged struggle. Dr. Hayes prepared a psychological evaluation that diagnosed Dana with severe oppositional defiant disorder with antisocial features, a combination of conditions that would justify enhanced sentencing under federal guidelines. The evaluation was based on her inappropriate knowledge of constitutional law and her refusal to accept lawful authority. Sarah Jenkins struggled to prepare an adequate defense against such overwhelming prosecutorial resources. Her public defender's budget allowed for basic legal research and minimal expert consultation. She couldn't afford private investigators to challenge false evidence or psychological experts to counter Dr. Hayes' fraudulent testimony. But Dana Mitchell continued providing legal assistance that transformed the quality of her own defense. Her knowledge of constitutional law, federal procedures, and evidence rules exceeded what most attorneys learned in law school. "Dana, I need to ask you something directly," Sarah said during a preparation meeting. "You're not just interested in justice. You have formal legal training. What's your real background?" Victoria maintained her cover while providing another technically truthful response. "I've spent my career working in institutions where understanding the law was essential for doing my job effectively." The statement was accurate. FBI directors needed comprehensive legal knowledge to navigate federal statutes, constitutional protections, and judicial procedures. But it allowed Sarah to assume that Dana had worked as a paralegal or legal secretary rather than as a federal law enforcement executive. The media attention surrounding Dana Mitchell's case had attracted some of the country's most prominent civil rights attorneys. They offered pro bono assistance, expert witnesses, and resources that could challenge Judge Roth's systematic violations. But Victoria Stone declined their assistance, knowing that high-profile legal representation would undermine the undercover operation. She needed to maintain her cover as an ordinary defendant until the federal investigation was ready for simultaneous arrests across multiple districts. The decision required Victoria to face trial with limited resources while federal prosecutors built cases that would eventually free thousands of wrongfully convicted defendants. It was a calculated sacrifice that served the greater good rather than her immediate interests. Judge Roth's desperation became more evident as the trial date approached. Federal oversight was intensifying, media scrutiny was expanding, and civil rights organizations were demanding answers about systematic bias in her sentencing patterns. She responded by accelerating the trial schedule and limiting pretrial motions that might expose prosecutorial misconduct. The compressed timeline would prevent adequate preparation while creating an atmosphere of judicial efficiency that impressed her political supporters. "The Constitution guarantees speedy trials," she announced to the media. "Miss Mitchell will receive prompt justice according to established legal procedures." The statement revealed her complete misunderstanding of constitutional protections. The right to a speedy trial belonged to defendants, not prosecutors seeking quick convictions. Defendants could waive that right to allow adequate preparation time. Judge Roth was violating constitutional procedure while claiming to uphold it. Sarah Jenkins filed motions requesting additional preparation time, expert witness funding, and access to prosecution evidence. Judge Roth denied every motion with minimal explanation, creating grounds for appeal while maintaining her schedule for quick disposition. The pretrial hearings attracted federal observers who documented every constitutional violation. Agent Blake attended as a court reporter whose real purpose was gathering evidence for the federal prosecution that would eventually destroy Judge Roth's network. Victoria Stone watched these proceedings with the clinical detachment of a federal investigator building a comprehensive case. Every denied motion, every procedural violation, every moment of judicial bias was being recorded for use in the federal prosecutions that would follow her revelation. But the personal cost was significant. Victoria had spent 6 months enduring systematic abuse, constitutional violations, and threats of violence. The psychological toll of maintaining her cover while watching Judge Roth destroy other defendants' lives required enormous emotional discipline. She sustained herself by remembering the thousands of victims whose cases would be overturned when Operation Justice Shield concluded successfully. Leon Thomas would be free. The families separated by excessive sentences would be reunited. The communities destroyed by systematic persecution would receive justice. The stakes justified the sacrifice. Harrison Development's pressure on Judge Roth intensified as the trial approached. The company's investment in Riverside District gentrification depended on removing minority residents through systematic prosecution. Dana Mitchell's case had become a test of whether their arrangement with Judge Roth could survive federal scrutiny. "The Mitchell case is becoming a liability," Harrison's chief executive officer told Judge Roth during a recorded phone conversation. "Federal prosecutors are asking questions about our charitable donations. Maybe it's time to consider a plea arrangement that makes this problem disappear." "Plea arrangements show weakness," Judge Roth responded. "We proceed with trial and conviction. Federal prosecutors will move on to other cases once they see that local justice systems can handle their own problems." The conversation demonstrated Judge Roth's complete failure to understand the magnitude of federal attention her courthouse was receiving. Agent Blake's investigation had expanded to include financial crimes specialists, civil rights attorneys, and racketeering prosecutors. The federal government wasn't conducting routine oversight. It was building a comprehensive criminal case. Officer Miller's nervousness became obvious as the trial date approached. His fabricated police reports couldn't withstand serious scrutiny, and his testimony about Dana Mitchell's violent resistance contradicted the physical evidence and witness statements. "I'm not comfortable with this," Miller told Bailiff Markson during a conversation recorded by courthouse surveillance equipment that Rebecca Winters had secretly connected to federal monitoring systems. "The defendant's lawyer is asking questions about my report that I can't answer." "You stick to the story we agreed on," Markson replied. "Judge Roth and DA Coington are counting on your testimony. You don't want to disappoint them." The conversation revealed the criminal conspiracy in explicit terms. Officer Miller had filed false reports at the direction of Judge Roth and DA Coington. The prosecution was built on perjury, fabricated evidence, and systematic obstruction of justice. Agent Blake's team had recorded over 100 hours of conversations that documented the conspiracy. Every participant had confessed to federal crimes while believing their communications were secure from federal monitoring. Rebecca Winters' surveillance operation had transformed the courthouse into a recording studio where Judge Roth's network systematically incriminated itself. The trial began on a Monday morning that would reshape American understanding of judicial corruption. The courtroom was packed with media representatives, federal observers, civil rights advocates, and curious citizens who had followed Dana Mitchell's case through social media coverage. Judge Roth entered with her characteristic arrogance, apparently believing that her judicial authority would intimidate federal oversight and guarantee prosecution victory. She had no idea that the defendant she was about to try was the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. "The case of the people versus Dana Mitchell," she announced with theatrical gravity. "The defendant is charged with criminal trespassing, resisting arrest, assault on a police officer, and contempt of court." The escalated charges revealed the desperation of Judge Roth's network. Simple trespassing had become felony assault through prosecutorial misconduct and evidence fabrication. The case represented everything wrong with the justice system when judges abandoned constitutional principles for personal gain. DA Coington's opening statement painted Dana Mitchell as a dangerous vagrant who had attacked a police officer and showed systematic disrespect for law and order. His presentation was smooth, professional, and completely divorced from the actual facts of the case. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, the defendant represents everything that threatens our community safety," Coington declared. She refused lawful police orders, physically attacked an officer attempting to perform his duties, and demonstrated the kind of antisocial behavior that destroys neighborhood security. Officer Miller's testimony followed the fabricated script he'd rehearsed with prosecutors. Dana Mitchell had been agitated and confrontational when asked to leave the park. She had quoted legal statutes in a threatening manner. She had tensed her muscles and attempted to pull away during the arrest process. Under cross-examination by Sarah Jenkins, Miller's story began collapsing. His description of Dana's violent resistance contradicted his own police reports. His claims about threatening behavior couldn't be substantiated with specific examples. His testimony about constitutional citations revealed that he didn't understand the legal concepts he claimed to have heard. But the real surprise came when Dana Mitchell exercised her constitutional right to question prosecution witnesses directly. "Officer Miller, you testified that I quoted legal statutes in a threatening manner. Can you identify which statutes I referenced?" Miller shifted uncomfortably in the witness chair. "I don't recall the specific citations. Your police report states that I cited constitutional amendments. Which amendments?" "I can't remember exactly. Did my citation of legal principles constitute a threat in any specific way?" The question was precisely crafted to expose the absurdity of the prosecution's case. Knowledge of constitutional law couldn't constitute criminal behavior. Citizens' understanding of their rights wasn't evidence of criminal intent. It showed a confrontational attitude, Miller replied weakly. "Officer Miller, is citizens' knowledge of constitutional rights inherently confrontational?" Judge Roth intervened before Miller could answer, but the damage was done. Dana Mitchell had demonstrated that she understood legal procedure better than the law enforcement officers who had arrested her. The gallery buzzed with confused whispers. Legal observers exchanged meaningful glances. Even the prosecution table seemed uncomfortable with the implications of their own case. Dr. Hayes' psychological testimony was devastating in its fraudulent thoroughness. Dana Mitchell suffered from severe oppositional defiant disorder evidenced by her inappropriate legal knowledge and refusal to submit to authority. The condition required intensive rehabilitation in a secure correctional environment. Under cross-examination, Dr. Hayes' lack of legitimate credentials became evident. Her doctoral degree was from an unaccredited online university. Her research was plagiarized from outdated textbooks. Her diagnostic methods violated professional standards for psychological evaluation. But Sarah Jenkins lacked the resources to expose the fraud completely. She could raise questions about Dr. Hayes' qualifications, but she couldn't afford expert witnesses to testify about the fabricated psychological evaluation. The trial was proceeding exactly as Judge Roth had planned. Quick conviction based on fabricated evidence and false testimony, followed by maximum sentencing that would remove Dana Mitchell from public attention. But Agent Blake's federal investigation was ready to conclude Operation Justice Shield with simultaneous arrests across 4 judicial districts. The comprehensive case against Judge Roth's network was complete. The evidence of systematic corruption was overwhelming. The time had come for Victoria Stone to reveal her true identity. The moment arrived during the afternoon of the second trial day, when D.A. Coington was presenting his closing arguments about the danger Dana Mitchell represented to community safety. "This defendant thinks she's above the law," Coington declared to the jury. "She thinks her supposed knowledge of constitutional procedure entitles her to resist police authority and threaten public order." Victoria Stone stood calmly at the defendant's table, her hand moving to the concealed pocket where she'd hidden her FBI credentials for 6 months. The time for revelation had arrived. "Your Honor," Dana Mitchell said clearly, her voice carrying the unmistakable authority of federal law enforcement, "I need to correct some factual errors in the prosecutor's statement." Judge Roth's face flushed with anger. "Sit down, Miss Mitchell. You'll have an opportunity to speak during sentencing." "I don't think you understand the situation, Judge Roth." Victoria's voice had changed completely. Gone was the respectful defendant's tone, replaced by the commanding presence of an FBI director. "This trial is concluded." She reached into her jacket and produced a leather folder that contained her FBI director credentials and badge. The gold shield gleamed under the courtroom lights as she placed it on the defendant's table and saying, the silence that followed was deafening. "My name is not Dana Mitchell," Victoria announced to the packed courtroom. "I am Director Victoria Stone of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and you are all under arrest." Judge Roth's face went through several color changes before settling on a shade that suggested cardiac distress. D.A. Coington dropped his legal files. Officer Miller gripped his chair as if the world was tilting beneath him. Bailiff Markson reached instinctively for his weapon before realizing that drawing arms against an FBI director would end his career and possibly his life. The main courtroom doors burst open as Agent Price led a tactical team into the chamber. 12 federal agents in full tactical gear flooded the room, weapons drawn but pointed safely downward in the controlled entry formation Victoria had perfected during her years as a field agent. "Federal Bureau of Investigation," Agent Price announced. "Everyone remain seated with your hands visible." The courtroom erupted into controlled chaos as reporters scrambled for cameras. Spectators gasped in shock, and court personnel tried to process what was happening. Judge Roth sat frozen behind her bench, her brain apparently unable to accept the reality unfolding before her. "Judge Agatha Roth," Victoria's voice carried across the chamber with the authority of federal law enforcement, "you are under arrest for violation of Title 18, United States Code Section 242, deprivation of rights under color of law." Agent Price approached the bench with handcuffs and a federal arrest warrant. "You are also under arrest for racketeering under Title 18, United States Code Section 1961, conspiracy to commit fraud, money laundering, and obstruction of justice." The click of handcuffs on Judge Roth's wrists echoed through the chamber with the finality of justice finally delivered. She was no longer a judge. She was a defendant facing federal prosecution for systematic violation of constitutional rights. "This is impossible," Judge Roth whispered as Agent Price read her Miranda rights. "I have judicial immunity. You can't arrest a sitting judge." "There is no immunity for criminal conspiracy," Victoria replied coldly. "There is no immunity for racketeering. There is no immunity for systematic violation of civil rights. You weren't a judge. You were a criminal enterprise masquerading as judicial authority." Simultaneous arrests proceeded with military precision. D.A. Coington was handcuffed by Agent Blake, who had been documenting prosecutorial misconduct for 6 months. Officer Miller was arrested by federal marshals who had been monitoring his false police reports. Bailiff Markson was taken into custody by the FBI tactical team that had practiced this moment for weeks. Patterson, the corrupt attorney, was arrested at his law firm by federal agents who had been building a comprehensive case against his role in the money laundering operation. Harrison Development executives were arrested at their corporate headquarters by financial crimes specialists who had traced millions of dollars in illegal transactions. The arrests extended beyond Judge Roth's immediate network. Federal authorities had coordinated simultaneous operations in 3 other judicial districts, arresting judges, prosecutors, and court personnel who had participated in the systematic corruption of American justice. Within 2 hours, the largest judicial corruption case in American history had resulted in 43 arrests across 4 states. The criminal enterprise that had operated under the protection of judicial immunity was finally facing federal accountability. Rebecca Winters, the courthouse clerk whose courage had made the investigation possible, was escorted to safety by federal marshals who would protect her during the trials that would follow. Her 3 years of documentation had provided the evidence foundation for convictions that would send Judge Roth and her co-conspirators to federal prison for the rest of their lives. "Rebecca," Victoria told the frightened woman as federal agents secured the courthouse, "your courage saved thousands of lives. The victims of this system will have justice because you were brave enough to document the truth." The media coverage was instantaneous and comprehensive. News networks interrupted regular programming to report the arrest of a federal judge by an undercover FBI director. Social media exploded with commentary about systematic corruption and federal accountability. Legal scholars provided analysis of the constitutional implications, but the most powerful reactions came from the victims of Judge Roth's system. Leon Thomas, watching the arrests on live television, broke down in tears of relief. Families who had lost loved ones to excessive sentences celebrated the possibility of appeals and compensation. Communities that had been systematically persecuted saw hope for genuine justice. If this story of an undercover FBI director dismantling judicial corruption left you speechless, wait until you hear our next story about a small-town sheriff who tried to frame an innocent family, not knowing the mother was actually an undercover federal marshal. That story drops next week, and it's even more shocking than what you just witnessed. The federal trials that followed Operation Justice Shield became landmarks in American legal history. Judge Agatha Roth and her co-conspirators faced the full weight of federal prosecution in trials that were broadcast live to audiences who had never seen systematic corruption exposed so thoroughly. The evidence was overwhelming. Audio recordings captured explicit criminal conspiracies. Financial records documented millions of dollars in illegal transactions. Witness testimony revealed the human cost of systematic persecution. Expert analysis demonstrated statistical patterns that constituted mathematical proof of racial bias. Judge Roth's legal team attempted every possible defense. They claimed entrapment, arguing that Victoria Stone had induced criminal behavior through her undercover operation. But federal prosecutors demonstrated that Judge Roth's corruption predated the FBI investigation by years. Victoria had documented existing criminal behavior rather than creating new violations. They claimed prosecutorial misconduct, arguing that federal authorities had violated judicial independence by investigating sitting judges. But federal statutes explicitly authorized civil rights investigations when constitutional violations were systematic and severe. Judge Roth's immunity extended only to judicial decisions made in good faith, not to criminal conspiracies disguised as legal proceedings. They claimed selective prosecution, arguing that other judges engaged in similar behavior without facing federal charges. But Agent Blake's investigation had resulted in prosecutions across 4 judicial districts, demonstrating that federal authorities were addressing systematic corruption comprehensively rather than targeting individual judges unfairly. Every defense strategy failed because the evidence of criminal behavior was so comprehensive and well documented. The trials revealed details that shocked even experienced federal prosecutors. Judge Roth's financial records showed luxury purchases that exceeded her judicial salary by more than 800%. Her charity had received over $2 million in donations from parties who received favorable rulings. Her husband's consulting firm had been paid for services that existed only on paper. The systematic persecution of minority defendants was even more extreme than initial investigations had suggested. Statistical analysis showed that Judge Roth's sentences for minority defendants were, on average, 600% longer than sentences for white defendants charged with identical crimes under identical circumstances. Dr. Patricia Hayes's false testimony had affected over 100 cases, resulting in wrongful convictions and excessive sentences based on fabricated psychological evaluations. Her lack of legitimate credentials meant that every case she had touched required review for prosecutorial misconduct and potential reversal. The money laundering operation involved 12 shell corporations, 6 offshore bank accounts, and complex financial transactions designed to hide the source and destination of illegal payments. Federal forensic accountants traced fund flows that connected judicial corruption to construction projects, political campaigns, and organized crime syndicates. But the most damaging evidence came from Judge Roth's own words. The recordings captured her explicit discussions about cleaning up neighborhoods through systematic prosecution of minorities. They documented her coordination with developers who profited from gentrification. They revealed her contempt for constitutional protections and her willingness to sell judicial decisions to the highest bidder. The trials lasted 8 months and resulted in convictions on all federal charges. Judge Agatha Roth was sentenced to life in federal prison without possibility of parole. The judge, who had imposed excessive sentences on thousands of defendants, would spend the rest of her life in the same federal correctional system she had fed with her victims. D.A. Coington received 35 years for his role in prosecutorial misconduct and conspiracy. Officer Miller was sentenced to 20 years for filing false police reports and systematic violation of civil rights. Bailiff Markson received 25 years for intimidation, assault, and conspiracy. Patterson and his law firm partners received sentences ranging from 15 to 20 years for money laundering and racketeering. Harrison Development executives were sentenced to between 10 and 30 years for bribery, conspiracy, and systematic violation of civil rights. Dr. Patricia Hayes received 20 years for perjury, fraud, and systematic provision of false testimony. Her lack of legitimate credentials meant that every psychological evaluation she had provided was fraudulent. The Harrison Development Corporation was dissolved, its assets forfeited to compensate victims of the systematic persecution it had orchestrated. The luxury condos built through gentrification were converted to affordable housing managed by community organizations. But the most significant outcome was the systematic review of every case that had passed through Judge Roth's courtroom. Federal authorities established a task force led by Sarah Jenkins, the former public defender whose courage during Operation Justice Shield had earned her promotion to federal oversight responsibilities. The review process identified over 3,000 cases where defendants had been systematically persecuted based on racial bias, prosecutorial misconduct, or judicial corruption. Leon Thomas was among the first to have his conviction overturned and his record expunged. He received compensation for wrongful imprisonment and enrolled in law school to pursue a career fighting systematic injustice. Thousands of other victims received similar relief. Families separated by excessive sentences were reunited. Communities destroyed by systematic persecution received federal resources for rebuilding. The federal government established a victim compensation fund that eventually distributed over $50 million to people whose lives had been destroyed by judicial corruption. The institutional reforms were equally comprehensive. Federal oversight monitors were installed in courthouses across the region to ensure constitutional compliance. Judicial training programs were redesigned to emphasize civil rights protections and constitutional procedure. Prosecutorial misconduct resulted in automatic federal review and potential criminal charges. But the most important change was cultural. The successful prosecution of systematic judicial corruption demonstrated that no one in America, not judges, not prosecutors, not wealthy developers, was above the law when they violated constitutional rights. Victoria Stone received widespread recognition for Operation Justice Shield, but she deflected credit to the victims whose courage had made justice possible. Rebecca Winters received federal protection and employment in a secure position where her skills could serve constitutional justice. Leon Thomas became a powerful advocate for criminal justice reform whose testimony influenced federal legislation. Sarah Jenkins was appointed to head the Federal Civil Rights Enforcement Division, where she continued fighting systematic persecution with resources adequate to challenge institutional corruption. Her experience defending Dana Mitchell had prepared her to protect constitutional rights at the federal level. Agent Caroline Blake received promotion to Deputy Director of the FBI's Civil Rights Division, where she oversaw investigations into systematic constitutional violations. Her work on Judge Roth's case became the model for federal prosecution of judicial corruption. Agent Price was promoted to supervise undercover operations targeting institutional corruption. His coordination of Operation Justice Shield demonstrated the FBI's capability to investigate even the most protected criminal networks. Rebecca Winters testified before Congress about the importance of federal oversight for local justice systems. Her courage in documenting systematic corruption influenced legislation that strengthened protections for court personnel who reported judicial misconduct. The success of Operation Justice Shield inspired similar investigations in jurisdictions across the country. Federal authorities identified patterns of systematic corruption that had operated undetected for decades. The prosecutions that followed resulted in hundreds of additional convictions and thousands of case reversals. But the most lasting impact was the restoration of public confidence in constitutional protections. The systematic prosecution of judicial corruption demonstrated that America's legal system could still hold its most powerful officials accountable when they betrayed their oaths. You're probably feeling that burning sense of justice seeing corruption finally face consequences. But this story represents something bigger. Proof that accountability is still possible in America. If you believe that no one should be above the law, hit that like button and subscribe, because we're committed to bringing you more stories of justice served. Your support helps us investigate and share these crucial accounts of constitutional rights being protected. 6 months after the trials concluded, Victoria Stone stood in the same courthouse where she had been systematically abused as Dana Mitchell. But now she was there as FBI director, overseeing the installation of federal monitoring systems that would prevent future corruption. The courthouse had been transformed. Judge Roth's courtroom was now presided over by federal Judge Maria Santos, a former civil rights attorney whose appointment demonstrated the commitment to constitutional justice. The new judge's first act was issuing formal apologies to every defendant who had been systematically persecuted by the previous regime. Sarah Jenkins's federal task force had completed its review of Judge Roth's cases, resulting in the largest mass exoneration in American history. Over 2,000 convictions were overturned, thousands of records were expunged, and millions of dollars in compensation were distributed to victims of systematic persecution. Leon Thomas graduated from law school with honors and joined the Federal Civil Rights Division as a prosecutor specializing in institutional corruption. His personal experience with systematic persecution made him uniquely qualified to recognize and combat similar violations. Rebecca Winters received recognition as Federal Employee of the Year for her courage in documenting judicial corruption. Her safety deposit box of evidence had provided the foundation for prosecutions that would protect constitutional rights for generations. But as Victoria reviewed the success of Operation Justice Shield, she received a disturbing report from Agent Blake about patterns of corruption that suggested the investigation had only scratched the surface of systematic violations. Director, we've identified similar patterns in 12 additional federal districts, Blake reported during their weekly briefing. The statistical anomalies are identical: disproportionate sentencing for minorities, unusual leniency for wealthy defendants, and financial patterns that suggest coordinated corruption. Victoria studied the data with growing concern. Judge Roth's network had been more extensive than anyone had realized. The corruption reached into federal courts, appellate panels, and possibly even Supreme Court decisions. What's the scope of the investigation? Victoria asked. We're looking at potential coordination between state and federal courts that could affect thousands of cases across multiple jurisdictions. The financial connections suggest a national network of judicial corruption that's been operating for decades. Victoria processed this information with the strategic thinking that had made Operation Justice Shield successful. Systematic corruption required systematic response. If judicial corruption extended to the federal level, then federal oversight would need to expand correspondingly. Initiate Operation Constitutional Shield, Victoria decided. Full federal investigation into systematic judicial corruption at all levels. Congressional oversight, Department of Justice resources, and FBI coordination. If this corruption is as extensive as the evidence suggests, we're going to need a comprehensive response. The decision launched the largest investigation into judicial corruption in American history. Federal authorities began examining patterns of systematic bias, financial irregularities, and constitutional violations that had operated under the protection of judicial immunity for generations. But as the investigation expanded, Victoria received an encrypted communication that suggested the corruption reached even higher than federal courts. Director Stone, the anonymous message read, Operation Justice Shield was impressive, but Judge Roth was small-scale compared to what's really happening. You have no idea how deep this goes. The real corruption reaches to levels of government that would shock the American people. The message included a single document, a memorandum marked classified and eyes only, that referenced something called Project Constitutional Framework. The document suggested coordination between judicial corruption and national security agencies that could affect fundamental constitutional protections. Victoria studied the document with growing alarm. If the allegations were true, then systematic corruption extended beyond local courts into federal agencies responsible for protecting national security. The implications for constitutional government were staggering. She immediately contacted Agent Blake to begin preliminary investigation into the allegations. But as federal authorities attempted to verify the document's authenticity, They discovered that key evidence had been classified at levels that prevented even FBI directors from accessing relevant information. Director, we're hitting classification barriers that suggest this investigation involves national security considerations, Blake reported. The agencies involved are claiming that constitutional corruption allegations threaten ongoing operations. Victoria recognized the pattern. Government agencies using national security classifications to hide constitutional violations from oversight. It was the same logic that Judge Roth had used to claim judicial immunity for criminal behavior. But this time, the corruption appeared to reach levels of government that controlled the oversight mechanisms designed to prevent systematic violations. Keep investigating within our authority, Victoria instructed. Document everything, and prepare for the possibility that this corruption reaches higher than we initially suspected. As Victoria left the courthouse that evening, she reflected on the success of Operation Justice Shield and the challenges that lay ahead. Judge Roth's network had been destroyed, thousands of victims had received justice, and constitutional protections had been restored to one jurisdiction. But the evidence suggested that similar corruption operated throughout American government, protected by classification systems and institutional immunity that made oversight difficult and accountability rare. The fight for constitutional justice was far from over. In fact, Operation Justice Shield had only revealed the beginning of systematic corruption that threatened the foundational principles of American democracy. Victoria Stone had spent 6 months as Dana Mitchell, experiencing systematic persecution and constitutional violations firsthand. The experience had strengthened her commitment to federal law enforcement and constitutional protection, but it had also revealed how easily American institutions could be corrupted when powerful people believed they were above the law. Judge Roth had operated her criminal enterprise for over a decade without meaningful oversight or accountability. The same conditions that enabled judicial corruption existed throughout American government. Without constant vigilance and systematic oversight, constitutional protections could be eroded by officials who placed personal gain above public service. Operation Justice Shield had demonstrated that accountability was still possible when courageous people were willing to fight systematic corruption. Rebecca Winters had documented judicial misconduct despite personal risk. Leon Thomas had testified about systematic persecution despite intimidation. Sarah Jenkins had fought constitutional violations despite professional pressure. Their courage had made justice possible. But protecting constitutional rights required similar courage from every generation of Americans who inherited the responsibility of democratic governance. As Victoria drove away from the courthouse, her secure phone buzzed with another encrypted message. Director Stone, congratulations on Operation Justice Shield. But Agatha Roth was just one node in a network that reaches the highest levels of American government. The real corruption involves federal agencies, congressional oversight, and judicial appointments that threaten constitutional democracy itself. Are you prepared to investigate corruption that could reach the Supreme Court? The message was accompanied by a photograph of a classified document marked Project Constitutional Framework, compartmentalized access required, Supreme Court coordination. Victoria stared at the document image, recognizing handwriting that belonged to federal officials she had worked with for years. If the allegations were true, then systematic corruption reached the apex of American government. She immediately called Agent Blake. Caroline, prepare Operation Constitutional Shield for immediate activation, full federal investigation with congressional oversight, and prepare for the possibility that we're about to investigate corruption that threatens the foundations of American constitutional democracy. The line was quiet for several seconds before Blake responded. Director, are you suggesting that systematic corruption reaches the Supreme Court level? I'm suggesting that Operation Justice Shield was just the beginning, Victoria replied. The real corruption is still out there, and it's protected by classification levels that we're going to need congressional authority to penetrate. As Victoria reached FBI headquarters, she made the decision that would define her career and potentially reshape American understanding of constitutional corruption. She would brief the Attorney General about the evidence suggesting systematic corruption at the highest levels of American government. She would request congressional oversight authority to investigate judicial corruption that extended beyond local courts. She would prepare for the possibility that protecting constitutional rights required challenging the most powerful institutions in American democracy. Operation Justice Shield had succeeded because Victoria Stone was willing to endure systematic persecution to document constitutional violations. Operation Constitutional Shield would succeed only if she was prepared to challenge corruption that could cost her career and potentially her life. But as she entered the FBI building where she had planned Operation Justice Shield, Victoria remembered the victims whose courage had made justice possible. Leon Thomas facing 3 years in prison for marijuana possession. Rebecca Winters risking her career to document corruption. Sarah Jenkins fighting systematic persecution with inadequate resources. Their courage had inspired her to spend 6 months as Dana Mitchell. Their suffering had motivated her to endure constitutional violations for the greater good of justice. Now their success in Operation Justice Shield would inspire her to investigate corruption that threatened the very foundations of American constitutional democracy. The fight for justice was expanding beyond local courthouses to federal institutions whose corruption could affect every American citizen's constitutional rights. Victoria Stone had spent 6 months discovering what happened when FBI directors investigated judicial corruption. Soon, she would learn what happened when FBI directors investigated systematic corruption that reached the highest levels of American government. The revolution that began in Judge Agatha Roth's courtroom was about to challenge every assumption about constitutional protection and governmental accountability in American democracy. The recording device that had captured Judge Roth's corruption was about to document evidence that would shock the American people and potentially reshape their understanding of how deeply systematic corruption had penetrated their government. The next phase of investigation would determine whether American democratic institutions could still hold their most powerful officials accountable when they betrayed their constitutional oaths. Victoria Stone believed they could. Tomorrow, she would begin finding out whether she was right. The story of Dana Mitchell's persecution had ended with justice delivered and constitutional rights restored. The story of Victoria Stone's investigation into systematic governmental corruption was just beginning. And the stakes were nothing less than the survival of constitutional democracy in America.